Welcome to Knowledge Targeting, a 50-part documentary series brought to you by TI One Voice. This is Part 1, Organized Stalking, a Target's View. I'm your narrator, and over the next hour we are going to walk through something most people have never heard of, yet which may be affecting millions of people across the world right now, as you listen to this. This episode is subtitled Foundational Definition and Structural Analysis of Organized Stalking as a Crime. It represents Part 1 of our series, Understanding the Phenomenon. Everything you will hear in this episode is based on a single, extraordinary book, a work that has become, in the community of targeted individuals, the closest thing to a first textbook. That book is Organized Stalking, a Target's View, written by the late Eleanor White, and held in the TI One Voice knowledge base as document number 765. Eleanor White was a retired engineer. She was also a target. She approached the subject of organized stalking the way an engineer approaches a fault report. She defined terms. She categorized. Wherever official data existed, she leaned on it. She wrote not for the already convinced, but explicitly for outsiders, for the general public, for public officials who have never heard of this crime. That discipline, that refusal to rely on anecdote alone, is why her book has endured for more than 2 decades as the field's essential reference point. Throughout this episode we will quote her often, and we will flag honestly where even she says the evidence runs out. What we are about to describe is a crime built, from the ground up, to be unseen. It is a crime engineered so perfectly for denial that the very people who witness pieces of it will swear nothing is happening. If that sounds impossible or paranoid, or like something from a conspiracy thriller, then you are already experiencing the crime's primary defense mechanism. Because that reaction, your instinctive skepticism, is not a flaw in the reporting. It is the intended product. The crime is designed to produce exactly that response in everyone who hears about it. Keep that paradox in mind as we proceed, because by the end of this episode you will understand that deniability is not a side effect of organized stalking. It is the crime's entire operating system. Let us begin with the words of Eleanor White herself, quoted from the book that anchors this entire series. She writes, and I quote, "An old crime, ganging up on someone, has been improved to the point where targets not only cannot escape it, but it can be done in ways that people around the target, who witness some of the harassing acts, will deny it is even happening." Read that sentence again in your mind. An old crime, ganging up on someone, has been improved. That single verb, improved, carries an entire world of chilling implications. It tells us that what we are dealing with is not spontaneous mobbing, not coincidental workplace bullying, not the random cruelty that humans have always been capable of. It is a deliberately engineered, systematically refined form of human predation. Someone, or some group of someones, took one of humanity's oldest vices and applied rigorous organizational principles to it. They made it efficient. They made it scalable. They made it invisible. White is describing a crime that has been optimized. Optimized for what? For denial. For deniability. This is the core insight of her entire body of work, and it is the lens through which every subsequent episode of this series must be understood. A traditional crime leaves evidence. A traditional stalker can be identified, arrested, prosecuted. But organized stalking, as White defines it, is a crime whose very structure is designed to make it impossible to prove, impossible to report, and, in many cases, impossible for anyone other than the target to even perceive. Think about what that means for the victim. You are being harassed, systematically, by dozens or hundreds of people, and yet every single incident, taken alone, looks like nothing. A stranger bumps into you on the street. A car horn honks at an odd moment. A neighbor says something slightly off. A coworker gives you a strange look. None of these things individually is a crime. None of them can be reported. None of them can be proven to be connected. But together, day after day, week after week, year after year, they form a pattern of persecution so relentless that it destroys the target's life, while remaining completely invisible to everyone around them. This is the paradox at the heart of organized stalking. It is a crime that is everywhere and nowhere at once. Here is our roadmap for this episode. We are going to ask 5 essential questions, and by the end, you will understand the architecture of a crime that most people do not believe exists. Question 1. What actually is organized stalking? We need a precise definition, and Eleanor White gives us one. A three-part framework that separates this phenomenon from a lone, obsessed stalker. This definitional work matters enormously because without it, we cannot even begin to discuss the problem. If we cannot name something, we cannot see it. If we cannot see it, we cannot stop it. Question 2. Why you? Why is a particular person chosen? This is the question every target asks at 3 in the morning, staring at the ceiling, running through every interaction they have ever had, every person they might have wronged, every secret they might have stumbled upon. White provides a known short list of reasons: whistleblowers, witnesses to crimes, hostile divorces, inheritance disputes, revenge, outspoken public voices. But here is the gut punch. She estimates that roughly 70% of targets fall into an unknown category, with no discernible reason they can find. And that not knowing, that void where an explanation should be, is not a footnote. It is itself a weapon. Question 3. The insider. If this crime is invisible, how do we know the groups are real? We have one extraordinary answer. David Lawson, a private investigator who spent approximately 12 years undercover inside actual organized stalking groups. His account remains the only documented insider look at how these networks operate on the ground. Question 4. The hidden scale. Officials say organized stalking does not exist. So Eleanor White does something very clever. She reads their own statistics, and what she finds, buried in the government's own data, is a multi-stalker, multi-year signature that the reports quietly admit. And question 5, the cover-up. Deniability, weaponized psychiatry, and the long road toward legal recognition. Keep the word deniability in your mind throughout this journey. It is the thread that ties the entire crime together, from its smallest street-level tactic to its largest structural machinery of concealment. These 5 questions form the architecture of everything that follows. Before we dive into the definitions, we need to spend a moment with our source, because in a field as contested and as poorly understood as organized stalking, the credibility of the source is everything. Why should we trust Eleanor White's book as our starting point? Eleanor White was, by profession, a retired engineer. That is not a biographical footnote. It is central to understanding how she approached this subject. An engineer, when confronted with a complex system failure, does not start by telling war stories. She starts by defining the problem, categorizing the symptoms, and searching for the root cause. She gathers data. She looks for patterns. She tests hypotheses against evidence. That is exactly what White did with organized stalking. She spent years cataloging the phenomenon. Her book runs approximately 115,000 words across 7 chapters. It is not a memoir, though she was herself a target. It is not a polemic, though she was clearly passionate about the subject. It is, in the truest sense, a field guide. She wrote it explicitly for outsiders, for members of the public and public officials who have never heard of this crime and who will, naturally, be skeptical. She anticipated that skepticism and met it with structure, with definitions, with official data wherever it could be found. She gave the community something it desperately needed: a common language. Before White, targets describing their experiences might use completely different vocabulary, making it impossible to see that they were describing the same phenomenon. White standardized the terms. She named the tactics. She created a taxonomy of harassment. And she did something else that is rare in this field. She was honest about the limits of her own knowledge. She explicitly flags the points where the evidence runs out, where her conclusions are speculative, and where she believes further investigation is needed. That intellectual honesty is precisely why her book, KB Document 765, has been the community's first field guide for over 20 years, and why it remains our foundational text for this series. Before the definitions, before the taxonomy, before the statistics, let us sit for a moment with the strangeness of what we are about to describe. Because organized stalking is not just another crime. It is a crime of a fundamentally different kind. It operates by rules that are almost the inverse of normal criminal behavior. Eleanor White describes targets who, and I quote, experience a blizzard of harassment for which there is no apparent cause. Every facet of their life comes under attack, from strangers on the street, from neighbors, from coworkers, even from some acquaintances. The harassment is not limited to one domain. It follows them from home to work to the grocery store. It persists across cities, across states, across international borders. And here is the truly disorienting part. Most of these harassers are complete strangers who have never met the target before, who have no personal grievance, and who, in many cases, apparently know nothing about the target except their name and perhaps some recently supplied piece of malicious misinformation. What makes this a genuinely new kind of crime is not any single act of harassment. It is that the acts are engineered specifically so that the people who witness them will deny anything is happening. This is the critical insight. The crime is not hidden in the shadows. It is hidden in plain sight. It is performed on public streets, in workplaces, in stores, in full view of bystanders. But every single incident, taken in isolation, reads as ordinary life. A stranger looks at you. So what? Car honks. Big deal. Someone coughs as you walk past. Are you paranoid? Each fragment is trivial, deniable, invisible. Only the cumulative pattern constitutes the weapon. And that pattern is perceptible only to the target, which is precisely the point. The crime is built, from the ground up, to be unseeable. Keep that word in your mind. Unseeable. By the end of this episode, you will understand that deniability is not a side effect of the crime. It is the crime's entire operating system. We now turn to Chapter 1 of Eleanor White's book, and to the foundational question, what is organized stalking? This definitional work matters more than it appears, because without precise language, we cannot even begin to discuss the problem coherently. White insists that organized stalking is categorically not a lone, obsessed stalker. That is the first and most important distinction. The cultural image of stalking, the one that lives in the public imagination, is a single obsessed individual fixated on a former lover or a celebrity. That is real. It happens. But it is not what we are talking about here. Organized stalking is something else entirely. It is a group phenomenon. It is structured. It is networked. And it operates according to principles that are almost the inverse of individual stalking. A lone stalker wants to be close to the victim. They want contact. They want a relationship, however twisted. An organized stalking network wants distance. It wants anonymity. It wants to coordinate the harassment of a target without ever revealing that coordination exists. A lone stalker leaves evidence of their obsession. Letters, phone calls, surveillance photos on their hard drive. An organized stalking network designs every act to be deniable, to look like nothing at all. A lone stalker can be caught. An organized stalking network, by its very structure, is designed to be uncatchable. 3 elements define this crime. We will examine each of them in detail over the next few minutes. They are: 1. The harassment comes from many people, not one. 2. Those people are handed the target's name and typically do not know them beforehand. And 3. The groups are networked locally, nationally, and internationally so that the harassment follows the target wherever they go. These 3 elements together form the definitional tripod on which the entire concept of organized stalking rests. Take away any one of them, and you are describing a different phenomenon. Together, they describe something chillingly new. Let us now examine each of the 3 defining elements of organized stalking in detail. Element number 1. Many, not one. The harassment comes from a substantial number of people, not a single obsessed stalker who knows the victim personally. This is the most fundamental distinction. We are not talking about a jealous ex-boyfriend. We are not talking about a celebrity stalker. We are talking about dozens, sometimes hundreds, of individuals participating in a coordinated campaign against a single person. Imagine the logistics required. For one person to be harassed by many strangers across multiple locations, across extended periods of time, requires coordination. Someone somewhere is organizing this. Someone is compiling lists. Someone is assigning tasks. Someone is ensuring that when the target leaves their house in the morning, there is a person waiting to follow them, and when they arrive at work, there is a different person ready to continue the harassment, and when they return home, there is yet another person stationed to pick up the baton. This is not random cruelty. This is organized labor. Element number 2. Strangers with a list. The stalkers are handed the target's name and typically do not know them beforehand. This is deeply disorienting for the target. If a stranger harasses you and you have never met them, your brain desperately searches for an explanation. Did I cut them off in traffic? Did I look at them the wrong way? Are they mentally ill? The truth, according to White, is far stranger. They are following instructions. They have been given your name and told something about you, something designed to make them feel justified in participating. They are not acting on personal grievance. They are acting on supplied grievance manufactured by whoever is coordinating the network. And element number 3, a tight network. The groups are networked within states, within provinces, and internationally. This is what makes escape feel impossible. With a lone stalker, you can move. You can change jobs, change cities, change countries. But if the network extends across all of those domains, then the harassment simply follows you. White reports that targets experience, and I quote, "no break in the harassment even when moving between countries." Think about what that implies about the scale and sophistication of the coordination involved. It is a chilling thought. So who actually carries this out? If organized stalking involves dozens or hundreds of people, who are they? What kind of person participates in the systematic psychological destruction of a stranger? The answer is uncomfortable, and it challenges our assumptions about who commits crimes. White's uncomfortable answer is this: the foot soldiers of organized stalking are largely ordinary people. Neighbors, co-workers, the person who passes you on the street every morning. They are not, for the most part, men in black suits driving unmarked vans. They are not trained intelligence operatives. They are everyday citizens who have been recruited, indoctrinated, and deployed against a target they have never met and against whom they hold no personal grievance. The investigator David Lawson, whom we will meet properly in Chapter 3, spent approximately 12 years infiltrating these groups. What he found was striking. The groups genuinely saw themselves as a kind of, and I quote his characterization, special community police. They believed they were performing a public service. They believed they were punishing bad people. They believed they were part of something righteous. This self-perception as vigilantes, as enforcers of some higher justice, is crucial to understanding how ordinary people can participate in extraordinary cruelty. White goes further in her analysis. She hypothesizes a long-running program to recruit, train, and vet reliable enforcers over time. Whether or not you accept this larger claim, and White herself is careful not to present it as proven fact, the structural implications are clear. A distributed, deniable, replaceable workforce of ordinary citizens is exactly what you would need to make harassment follow one person across a city or across a border. The ordinariness of the perpetrators is not a contradiction to the scale of the crime. It is the very thing that makes the scale possible. One reason this crime stays invisible, one reason it has been so difficult for targets to organize and for researchers to study, is that it hides under an extraordinary number of different names. Eleanor White catalogs these names deliberately, so that newcomers to the subject are not thrown by the vocabulary, and so that targets who have been experiencing different facets of the same phenomenon can recognize each other. Let us run through the lexicon. Gang stalking is perhaps the most common term, used widely in online communities. Group stalking and multi-stalking emphasize the multiple perpetrator character. Community stalking highlights the distributed, neighborhood-based nature of the harassment. Co-stalking is David Lawson's term, emphasizing that the stalkers believe they are punishing the target for some cause, some perceived transgression. Mobbing is the term used when the harassment occurs in a workplace context, and it has a substantial academic literature of its own, though that literature rarely connects it to the larger phenomenon White describes. Street theater is the term for the small harassment performances conducted in public, which we will examine in detail shortly. But the lexicon does not stop at physical, in-person harassment. On the electronic side, White catalogs terms that sound like science fiction but which correspond to documented military research programs. Electronic assault, directed energy weapons, abbreviated DEW, non-lethal weapons, mind control, and perhaps the most striking term of all, voice-to-skull, abbreviated V2K, a term that White notes appears in the United States Army's own thesaurus. Whether or not you believe in the reality of these technologies, and White is careful to note that the electronic dimension is the hardest to verify. The vocabulary matters. Because a target who reports hearing voices may be diagnosed as schizophrenic, while a target who uses the term voice-to-skull may, at least in principle, be describing a military technology. Same crime, many masks. Knowing the masks is the first defense against confusion and against the disinformation that thrives on chaos. Eleanor White's most useful single image, the concept that unlocks the entire phenomenon for the uninitiated, is what she calls the master menu. Organized stalking is not one fixed script applied identically to every target. It is a menu of tactics, a catalog of harassment methods, from which a customized program is assembled for each individual target. This explains why two targets can describe wildly different experiences and both be telling the truth. One target may experience primarily street theater and noise campaigns, while another may experience electronic harassment and workplace mobbing. Both are describing organized stalking. They are simply describing different selections from the master menu. The menu spans 4 broad domains. First, things done in the community. Street theater, noise campaigns, following, so-called brighting where high beams are flashed at the target's home. Second, electronic harassment. Voice-to-skull, directed energy weapons, through-wall devices. Third, institutional attacks, mobbing at work, sabotage at school, and, most devastatingly, weaponized psychiatry. And fourth, social attacks. The rumor campaign, the lie campaign, the systematic effort to turn the target's own friends and family against them. And here is the crucial detail that makes the whole system work. The visible pieces, every single act of harassment that a bystander might witness, are always designed to appear as life's normal bad luck. A stranger bumps into you on the sidewalk. The elevator doors close just before you reach them. Your coffee order is wrong. A dog barks as you walk past. These are all things that happen to everyone all the time. The difference is the density, the frequency, the precision of the timing, and the fact that they are directed at a single person by a coordinated network. The camouflage is not incidental. The camouflage is the whole game. One tactic from Eleanor White's master menu deserves its own moment of focused attention, because it is the one that outsiders find hardest to believe, and because it illustrates more clearly than any other how the mechanism of deniability actually operates in practice. That tactic is street theater. Street theater refers to small harassment performances conducted in public, in full view of the target. A stranger on the sidewalk repeats a phrase that you just thought in the privacy of your own mind. The same unusual object, a yellow car, a person in a red hat, a distinctive piece of graffiti, appears again and again in your path, in ways that defy random chance. A choreographed coincidence unfolds before your eyes. Two strangers have a conversation about something deeply personal to you, then walk away as if nothing happened. A person in a crowd makes a gesture that only you would understand, a gesture that references something from your private life, your private thoughts. Each individual incident taken alone is trivial. If you tried to report it to the police, you would sound deranged. A stranger repeated a word? So what? A yellow car drove past you twice? That happens. Someone in a crowd made a gesture? You must be imagining things. This is the cruel genius of street theater. The individual components are not just deniable, they are designed to make the person reporting them sound paranoid. The pattern, the weapon, is invisible to everyone except the target. And so the target faces an impossible dilemma. To describe street theater at all, to give voice to what is happening, is to sound trivial at best and mentally ill at worst. But to remain silent is to allow the harassment to continue unchallenged. The target cannot win. The reaction that street theater is engineered to produce, skepticism, dismissal, a psychiatric referral, is exactly the reaction it produces. It is gaslighting transformed from a domestic abuse technique into an industrial-scale public performance. It is harassment weaponized through the very psychology of denial. We now turn to Chapter 2 of Eleanor White's book, and to the question that every target asks at 3 in the morning, staring at the ceiling in the dark. Why me? White calls this question, and I quote, the greatest barrier to exposing and stopping organized stalking. That is a remarkable claim, and it deserves careful unpacking. Why would the question of motivation be the greatest barrier to stopping the crime? Because not knowing is itself a weapon. Because a person who cannot explain what is happening to them is far easier to isolate, far easier to gaslight, and far easier to dismiss. Think about how human psychology works. When something terrible happens to us, our first instinct is to search for a cause. Why did I get fired? Why did my relationship end? Why did that car hit me? If we can identify a cause, we can construct a narrative. We can assign blame. We can take action. But what if there is no identifiable cause? What if you are being systematically destroyed by dozens of strangers and you have no idea why? The psychological effect is profoundly destabilizing. You cannot. Let us look more closely at who gets chosen for organized stalking and at the brutal mathematics of not knowing. Eleanor White provides a known shortlist of selection categories. Whistleblowers who exposed corruption and made powerful enemies. Witnesses to serious crimes who were never supposed to see what they saw. People caught in hostile divorces where one party has connections to a stalking network. Inheritance disputes where money and property are at stake, and where discrediting a rival can shift the outcome. Personal revenge, where someone with access to a network decides to use it against an enemy. And outspoken public voices, activists, journalists, community leaders, anyone who has made themselves visible and controversial. These categories are recognizable. They make sense. You can construct a narrative around any of them. You did something. Someone didn't like it. They retaliated. The logic is cruel, but it is at least a logic. But here is the gut punch. White estimates that roughly 70% of targets fall into an unknown category. 7 out of 10 targets have no discernible reason for being targeted. They are not whistleblowers. They are not witnesses. They are not involved in divorce battles or inheritance fights. They are ordinary people leading ordinary lives. And out of nowhere, a blizzard of harassment descends upon them for no reason they can discover. Why would such a large fraction of targets be in this unknown category? White offers several hypotheses. The target may have been selected at random as a test case as training material for new recruits. The target may have been selected through a bureaucratic process, some algorithm or system to which they have no access. The target's offense may be something so trivial, so long ago, that they genuinely cannot connect it to the harassment. Or the selection may be entirely arbitrary, proof that the network is so large, so well-resourced, that it can afford to persecute people for no reason at all. Any of these explanations is chilling. Together, they paint a picture of a system that operates according to its own inscrutable logic, a logic to which the target has no access and no appeal. So how do you get ordinary neighbors, ordinary coworkers, ordinary passers-by on the street to torment a complete stranger, day after day, month after month, year after year? The answer is as old as human cruelty and as modern as any propaganda campaign. You lie to them. Eleanor White documents what she calls the ongoing lie campaign. She describes it with brutal precision. And I quote her directly now. Vicious rumors are told that the target has a long criminal record, is a thief, a prostitute, is doing or selling drugs, and when supervisors really want maximum effort from their troops, that the target is a pedophile. Read that sentence carefully. There is a hierarchy of accusations here. The campaign starts with general character assassination. The target is a criminal, a thief, a drug dealer. These are serious charges, but they are charges that might still allow room for doubt, might still leave open the possibility that the target has some redeeming quality, some path to redemption. But then, and White is explicit about this, when the handlers want maximum zeal from their workers, the accusation escalates. It escalates to the one charge that shuts down all human sympathy, that the target is a pedophile. This is a calculated escalation. The accusation of pedophilia is uniquely effective as a tool of social destruction. It requires no evidence. It is almost impossible to disprove, and it generates a visceral, automatic reaction of revulsion in anyone who hears it. Once that accusation is planted, the target becomes subhuman in the eyes of the community. Anything done to them is justified. Any cruelty is righteous. The accusation does not just discredit the target. It dehumanizes them completely, and here is what makes this even more chilling. White notes that many of the harassers themselves suspect the lies are false. They know, or at least they strongly suspect, that the target is not a pedophile, not a drug dealer, not a criminal. and yet they keep participating. Why? Because, as White observes, and I quote, many of them simply keep harassing targets to maintain approval by their peers. It is mob psychology industrialized. It is the social pressure of the group, the fear of being the next target, the desire to belong, the unwillingness to challenge the consensus. Ordinary human weakness exploited at scale to destroy innocent strangers. We now arrive at Chapter 3 of Eleanor White's book, and at one of the most remarkable figures in the entire literature on organized stalking, David Lawson, the private investigator who went inside. If you have been skeptical so far, and skepticism is healthy when confronting claims this extraordinary, then Chapter 3 is where the phenomenon stops being one person's word against the world and acquires an outside witness, an independent observer who documented what he found. Lawson's story begins in an almost poetic way. He was a private investigator, someone professionally trained in surveillance and in noticing what others miss. And he found these groups not through a tip, not through a target's testimony, but simply by listening. He was monitoring a public service radio scanner, the same kind of device that police, taxi dispatchers, and emergency services use for routine communications. On that scanner, he heard coordination that should not have existed. He heard people, ordinary people with no official status, discussing the surveillance and harassment of specific individuals. He heard them using coded language, assigning tasks, reporting on locations, coordinating their movements. It is worth pausing on this detail. The crime leaves traces. It has to. To coordinate dozens or hundreds of people across a city, you need communication. You need logistics. And communication, even encrypted or coded communication, can in principle be intercepted. Lawson heard it. He followed it. And he spent the next 12 years of his life documenting it. 12 years. Think about the dedication required. This was not a journalist spending a weekend on a story. This was a professional investigator who made organized stalking his life's work. His findings transformed the field. For the first time, there was an account of organized stalking that did not come from a target, that was not filtered through the potentially compromised perspective of someone under psychological siege. It came from a trained observer with no personal stake in the outcome. It is the closest thing we have to independent verification, and it corroborates in detail after detail what targets have been reporting for decades. Let us go deeper into the story of how David Lawson first encountered the organized stalking machine, because the method of his discovery tells us something profound about the nature of the crime itself. Picture the scene. Lawson is sitting with a radio scanner, the kind that picks up public service frequencies. Police bands, taxi dispatch, security guard chatter, the mundane background noise of a city operating. And in that noise, he begins to hear something anomalous. Not the official voices of law enforcement, but civilians. Ordinary people communicating in a way that suggests they are engaged in some kind of organized surveillance operation. They are tracking someone. They are reporting movements. They are coordinating with each other. This is the first lesson. Organized stalking leaves traces because it must. Coordination requires communication. A network of dozens of people cannot function without people talking to each other, and people talking to each other can be overheard. The crime is built for deniability at the level of individual acts, but it is vulnerable at the level of coordination. Lawson found that vulnerability and he exploited it. The second lesson is that Lawson was able to follow the thread because he had the patience and the professional training to do so. He did not dismiss what he heard as crank radio chatter or as figments of overheated imagination. He took it seriously. He investigated. He followed the people involved. He built relationships. Over the course of 12 years, he won the confidence of these groups and eventually gained inside access, riding along on operations, documenting how the groups functioned, who was involved, and what they believed they were doing. This is an extraordinary achievement. Infiltrating a criminal organization is difficult under any circumstances. Infiltrating an organization whose entire purpose is to remain invisible, whose members are trained in counter-surveillance and operational security, is almost unimaginably difficult. Lawson did it. His account remains the only documented inside look at organized stalking groups operating at the local level. What exactly did David Lawson find inside these groups? And what does Eleanor White make of his findings? The answers to both questions are essential to understanding the current state of knowledge about organized stalking. First, what Lawson found. He documented a network that cast itself as a kind of special community police, volunteers who believed they were supplementing the work of official law enforcement by punishing people who, in their view, had escaped justice. The groups had structure. They had leadership. They had methods of recruitment. They had communication protocols. They had target lists. And they had a shared ideology that justified what they were doing. They were the good guys, the targets were bad people who deserved what was coming to them, and the official system was too weak or too corrupt to do what needed to be done. Lawson called this phenomenon cause stalking, a term that emphasizes the ideological dimension. The stalkers believe they are acting for a cause. That cause might be public safety, or moral righteousness, or community protection. Whatever the specific framing, the essential elements are the same. A self-appointed group operating outside the law, punishing individuals they have judged to be guilty, using methods designed to be undetectable. It is vigilantism industrialized. Now, what does White make of all this? She is careful, and we should follow her example. She says that Lawson's first-hand observations are, and I quote, a perfect match for what targets experience. She trusts his observations. They align with everything targets have been reporting. But she disputes his conclusions about who is ultimately responsible for the network. Lawson believed the groups were essentially grassroots, local vigilante organizations with no higher authority. White believes, or at least suspects, that they are part of something larger, something with institutional backing. This is a crucial methodological point. Observations trusted. Theory held at arm's length. White models the intellectual discipline that this subject desperately needs. We can agree on what is happening without agreeing on who is ultimately responsible, and we need to keep those two questions separate. It is the only way to build a reliable body of knowledge. We now turn to Chapter 4 of Eleanor White's book and to a question that is often asked by skeptics. If organized stalking is real, if it is truly happening on the scale that targets describe, where are the numbers? Where are the statistics? Where is the official data? The answer is both surprising and damning. The numbers exist. They are hiding in plain sight, buried in the government's own crime statistics. Officials say organized stalking does not exist. So White does something very clever. She reads their own reports and she finds, hidden within the data, a signature that cannot be explained by the conventional understanding of stalking as a crime committed by a lone individual. Let us talk about the United States Department of Justice Stalking Victimization Report, published in January 2009 under catalog number NCJ 224527. This is official government data. It is not anecdotal. It is not testimony from targets. It is a statistical survey conducted by the Bureau of Justice Statistics using standard methodology. The conventional headline from this report is that most stalking involves a single perpetrator. 62% of victims named exactly one stalker. This is the picture that fits the cultural script. A lone obsessive, usually an ex-partner, usually a man stalking a woman. That is real. But it is not the whole picture. Because look at what else the data shows. 13% of victims named 3 or more stalkers. 3 or more. That is not a lone obsessive. That is a group. And another 6.5% said they did not know who was stalking them. They knew they were being stalked, but the perpetrators were strangers, anonymous figures whose identities they could not determine. Add 13% and 6.5% and you get nearly 1 in 5 victims of stalking in America who report multiple stalkers or unknown stalkers. That is the multi-perpetrator signature that defines organized stalking. And the government's own data confirms that it exists. Let us dig deeper into the numbers that the United States Department of Justice itself collected, because buried within this official data is a profile of a phenomenon that the same government refuses to acknowledge. 62% of stalking victims named a single stalker. That is the majority. That is the picture that fits the cultural narrative. But 13% named 3 or more. Think about that. 3 or more. If a person tells you they are being stalked by 3 different people or 5 or 10 or 20, what does that imply? It implies coordination. It implies that these people are not acting independently. It implies that someone somewhere has given all of them the same target. That is organized stalking, whether the government wants to use those words or not. And another 6.5% did not know. They were victims of stalking. They knew they were being stalked. They experienced the harassment, the fear, the disruption to their lives, but the perpetrators were strangers. Anonymous faces. Unknown identities. This is exactly what we would expect from a crime designed for deniability. If the stalkers do not know the target and the target does not know the stalkers, then the entire transaction is untraceable. The target cannot identify their harassers to the police because the harassers are just random people on the street, in the grocery store, in the next car over. White does something concrete with these numbers. She infers that the nearly 20% of victims with multiple or unknown stalkers could translate to something like 500,000 Americans. 500,000. That is not a fringe phenomenon. That is a public health crisis. And here is the additional data point that locks it in. 11% of stalking victims in the same Department of Justice survey reported being stalked for 5 years or more. 5 years. Not 5 days. Not 5 weeks. 5 years or more of sustained, coordinated harassment. That duration data alone rules out the jealous ex, the obsessed fan, the motive-driven lone stalker. Those kinds of individual obsessions tend to burn out. They get arrested. They move on. Or they escalate to violence and the stalking stops one way or another. But organizational harassment has institutional stamina. It can persist indefinitely because the perpetrators are replaceable cogs in a machine. The machine does not get tired. The machine does not get arrested. The machine does not move on. The multi-perpetrator signature is not limited to the United States. Eleanor White pulls the same thread through the official data of other countries, and what emerges is a quiet, consistent pattern that crosses national borders. Let us start with the United Kingdom. Britain's Home Office estimated that around 1.9 million people were victims of stalking or harassment at any one time, and that was back in 2001. 1.9 million people. That is roughly 3% of the entire population. And here is a detail that White finds particularly striking. About 45% of those stalking victims were men. 45%. That is a very different picture from the conventional view of stalking as a crime almost exclusively committed by male perpetrators against female victims. This gender distribution matters for several reasons. First, it contradicts the cultural narrative that dominates public understanding and, by extension, public policy. If nearly half of stalking victims are men, then the laws, the support services, the public awareness campaigns that frame stalking as violence against women are missing a huge portion of the affected population. Second, it is consistent with what we would expect from organized stalking. If the perpetrators are not motivated by sexual obsession or romantic fixation, but by something impersonal, something organizational, then there is no reason to expect a gender skew. The machine does not care whether you are a man or a woman. It just needs a target. Now let us turn to Canada. Statistics Canada reported nearly 11,000 criminal harassment incidents in 2006. Of those, 13% involved more than one accused. Again, that multi-perpetrator signature. 3 countries. 3 independent datasets. 1 quiet, consistent pattern. The data is not hidden. It is not suppressed. It is published. It is available to anyone who cares to look. And yet, somehow, the multi-stalker signature has never, in any official response, been linked to the possibility of organized stalking. The data says one thing. The officials say another. That gap, the gap between what the numbers show and what the authorities acknowledge, is itself evidence of the machinery of denial that we will examine in Chapter 5. One number from the Department of Justice report deserves its own moment of focus, because it may be the most quietly damning statistic in the entire field of stalking research. 11% of stalking victims in the United States, better than 1 in 9, were stalked for 5 years or more. 1 in 9. Let that sink in. Think about what 5 years of continuous harassment means. 5 years of being followed. 5 years of street theater. 5 years of noise campaigns at all hours of the night. 5 years of the lie campaign turning your neighbors and coworkers against you. 5 years of the master menu, customized to you, applied every single day, week after week, month after month, with no end in sight. 5 years is an undergraduate degree. 5 years is a presidential term. 5 years is long enough for a child to go from kindergarten to middle school. 5 years is an eternity in the life of someone who cannot sleep, cannot work, cannot trust anyone, and cannot explain to anyone what is happening to them. Now think about what 5 years of continuous harassment rules out. It rules out the jealous ex. Jealousy burns out. People move on. They find new partners. They get tired. It rules out the obsessed fan. Obsessions fade. New celebrities emerge. Life intervenes. It rules out the individual stalker motivated by a specific grievance. Individual stalkers run out of energy. They make mistakes. They get caught. They escalate to violence, and the legal system finally intervenes. But organized stalking does not burn out. It does not fade. It does not get caught because there is no single perpetrator to catch. It persists because the machine has institutional stamina, because the perpetrators are replaceable, because the coordination is distributed, because the motivation is not personal pathology but organizational mandate. White calls a duration of 5 years or more, and I quote, very characteristic of organized stalking. It is a fingerprint in the numbers. It is a signature that cannot be explained by any model of individual stalking. And crucially, it is a signature that appears in official government data. Duration is measurable. It is quantifiable. It is hard for officials to wave away as anecdotal or imagined. And that is precisely why it matters legally, politically, and strategically. It is a wedge for recognition. It is the kind of data point around which a movement for legal reform can organize. We now arrive at Chapter 5 of Eleanor White's book, the keystone of her entire analysis. Deniability. This is the concept that ties everything we have described in the previous 4 chapters into a single coherent system. This is the mechanism by which organized stalking protects itself from exposure, from prosecution, and from the very recognition that it exists. Everything we have described so far, the multi-perpetrator structure, the stranger-based harassment, the street theater, the master menu, the lie campaign, all of it is engineered with a single overriding design principle. The harassment must be deniable. Every act taken individually must look like ordinary life, like coincidence, like bad luck, like the target's imagination. Because if any single act looked like what it actually is, a coordinated assault on a specific human being, the whole operation would collapse. The deniability of the individual act protects the entire network. White traces a devastating logic here. Trace the loop with me. Step 1. The harassment is designed to look like ordinary bad luck. A stranger looks at you strangely. A car horn honks at an odd moment. Your neighbor says something slightly off. Step 2. Witnesses, if there are any, only ever see fragments. They see one incident, isolated, contextless. They do not see the hundreds of other incidents that have preceded it and that will follow it. Step 3. When the target finally tries to report the whole pattern, to explain the cumulative effect of hundreds of individually trivial incidents, the report itself sounds implausible. It sounds paranoid. Sounds like mental illness. Step 4. Every single official, White reports, gives the same reply. There is no organized stalking. You need to see a psychiatrist. Step 5. The pathologization of the target raises deniability further. The target is now labeled as mentally unstable, which means that any future complaint, however well documented, will be dismissed as a symptom rather than a report of a real crime. Step 6. With deniability now higher than ever, the harassment can escalate. The loop closes. It is a perfect trap. It is a self-reinforcing cycle of persecution and discreditation. And White calls secrecy the reason organized stalking has continued and grown for over 2 decades. Let us map the deniability loop more carefully, because understanding this mechanism is essential to understanding why organized stalking has been so resistant to exposure and so devastating to its victims. The loop begins with the design of the harassment itself. The visible acts of organized stalking are never overt crimes that could be captured on a security camera and presented as evidence. They are calibrated to look like the ordinary friction of daily life. A stranger bumps into you on the sidewalk. Your coffee order is wrong. A car follows you for 3 blocks and then turns away. A dog barks aggressively as you walk past. Someone coughs loudly just as you begin to speak. These are all things that happen to everyone all the time for entirely innocent reasons. Step 2. Fragmentation. The harassment is distributed across time, across space, and across perpetrators. No single witness ever sees more than a tiny fraction of the whole. A coworker sees you look flustered after an incident on your commute. A neighbor hears a strange noise at night. A friend notices you seem paranoid and withdrawn. But none of these people see the full picture. They see isolated fragments and they interpret those fragments through the lens of normal life. Step 3. The reporting paradox. To report organized stalking, the target must describe a pattern. But the pattern, by its very nature, sounds implausible. It violates the basic assumption that underlies all social interaction, the assumption that the world is basically random and that coincidences happen. The target is claiming that the coincidences are not coincidences, that they are coordinated, that they are directed at them personally. This claim, in the absence of any single piece of hard evidence, sounds exactly like paranoia. Step 4. The official response. White says that every single official repeats the same line. There is no organized stalking. You need to see a psychiatrist. This is not a conspiracy of silence. It is worse. It is a structural incapacity. The institutions of law enforcement and mental health are not designed to deal with crimes that are composed entirely of individually trivial incidents distributed across dozens of anonymous perpetrators. The system quite literally cannot see the crime because it is designed to process crimes with identifiable perpetrators, identifiable victims, and identifiable evidence. Organized stalking has none of these. Step 5. Escalation. Once deniability is established, once the target has been labeled, the harassment can increase. Higher levels of harassment are now even more deniable because the target's credibility has been destroyed. Reports of escalation are met not with increased concern but with increased certainty that the target is mentally ill. The loop feeds on itself until the target is completely isolated and completely silenced. There is one weapon in the master menu of organized stalking that is more powerful than all the others combined, and Chapter 5 of Eleanor White's book names it directly. It is the mental health system itself. This is a difficult and uncomfortable topic. Psychiatry is a legitimate branch of medicine that has helped millions of people. But like any institution, it can be misused, can be weaponized. And in the context of organized stalking, White argues that psychiatric diagnosis functions as the ultimate punishment, the final silencer of the target. White writes that forced psychiatric treatment, and I quote, pretty well disables further attempts by the target to get the crime remedied. She calls it the ultimate punishment, not because psychiatric care is inherently punitive, but because a psychiatric label does something that no other weapon in the arsenal can do. Pre-explains every future complaint as a symptom. Once a target has been diagnosed with a mental illness, every report they make, every cry for help, every piece of evidence they present, is filtered through that diagnosis. They are not reporting a crime. They are exhibiting symptoms. They do not need legal protection. They need medication. And here is the tragic paradox at the heart of this weapon. The very reactions that organized stalking is designed to produce in its targets are the same reactions that the diagnostic criteria for certain mental disorders describe. Hypervigilance. You are constantly scanning your environment for threats. That is a rational response to being constantly harassed. But it is also a symptom of paranoia. Social withdrawal. You stop trusting people because people keep hurting you. That is a rational response to a systematic campaign of social destruction. But it is also a symptom of depression or anxiety. Distrust of authority. You stop going to the police because the police have repeatedly failed to help you. That is a rational response to institutional indifference, but it is also a symptom of persecutory delusion. The target is trapped in a double bind of existential cruelty. Seek help, and you risk a diagnosis that will permanently discredit you. Stay silent, and you remain unprotected, with no avenue of redress. There is no safe move. This is the clinical logic of organized stalking. It does not just attack the target's life. It attacks the target's standing as a credible witness to their own experience. It takes the one tool that every victim of crime relies on, the ability to say, "This is happening to me," and to be believed, and it destroys that tool completely. Let us examine the machinery of denial in its full institutional context, because what Eleanor White describes is not merely psychological manipulation of individual targets. It is a system of enforcement that extends to the highest levels of official response. White argues that targets of organized stalking are held to a much higher standard of evidence than targets of other crimes. If you are mugged on the street, the police do not demand that you provide video evidence, witness testimony, and a written confession from the mugger before they will take your report. They take your report. They investigate. They accept that you are a victim until proven otherwise. But in organized stalking, the burden of proof is inverted. The target must first prove that the crime exists at all, that it is possible, that it happened, before anyone will even consider that they might be a victim. And because organized stalking is designed precisely to be unprovable by ordinary evidentiary standards, this higher bar of proof is an insurmountable wall. White goes further, into uncomfortable historical territory. She observes that crime that is ignored by officials is exactly the pattern seen in the run-up to dictatorship in Nazi Germany and in Soviet Russia. This is not to equate the scale or the horror of those regimes with the phenomenon of organized stalking. White is careful not to make that equation. But she is pointing to a structural pattern. When official institutions systematically refuse to acknowledge a category of crime, when they pathologize the victims and protect the perpetrators, the result is not just individual injustice. It is a corrosion of the rule of law itself. Citizens learn that the institutions designed to protect them will not do so, and the social contract unravels. And then there is the question of lineage. White flags a possible historical precedent in the FBI's COINTELPRO program, which we will examine in detail in the next slide and in a dedicated episode later in this series. For now, what matters is her methodology. She flags the resemblance. She notes the similarity of tactics. She explicitly qualifies it as a hypothesis to be tested, not a conclusion to be asserted. That discipline, the ability to draw connections without overclaiming, is one of the things that makes her work credible and that allows it to serve as the foundation for further investigation rather than as a closed dogma. Is there any documented historical precedent for a state or an organized network systematically harassing its own citizens using rumor, surveillance, and social sabotage? There is, and it is not speculative. It is declassified. It is a matter of public record. Eleanor White points to the FBI's counterintelligence program, known by its acronym COINTELPRO, which ran from 1956 to 1971. COINTELPRO was a covert FBI program that targeted domestic political organizations and individuals the Bureau deemed subversive. The tactics, as documented in declassified FBI memoranda, included rumor campaigns designed to discredit targets, anonymous mailings to employers and family members, infiltration of organizations, surveillance, harassment, and the deliberate fostering of conflict and paranoia within targeted groups. The program's explicit goal was to neutralize individuals and organizations that the FBI had decided were threats. The playbook is strikingly familiar to anyone who has studied organized stalking. Anonymous harassment, rumor campaigns, psychological warfare, social destruction, targeting of individuals through coordinated, deniable action by multiple participants. The FBI even planted false stories in newspapers, sent forged letters, and created fake publications, all designed to destroy the credibility and social standing of their targets. One of the ugliest chapters in COINTELPRO's history involved the actress Jean Seberg. The FBI, seeking to neutralize her because of her financial support for the Black Panther Party, planted a false rumor that she was pregnant by a Black Panther member. The rumor was printed in a gossip column. The stress contributed to a miscarriage. Seberg later died by suicide. This is a real, documented, government-sponsored lie campaign that destroyed a human being. It happened. It is not a theory. It is declassified history. White's own words on the connection are measured. She says, and I quote, "Certainly the tactics are similar." Note her caution. She is not claiming that COINTELPRO evolved into organized stalking. She is noting a resemblance, a pattern, a set of techniques that the American government has demonstrably used against its own citizens. Whether that pattern reflects a direct lineage, an institutional culture that persists across organizations and decades, or simply the fact that certain methods of harassment are universal because they are effective, is a question for further investigation. We will put COINTELPRO and its possible relationship to organized stalking under the microscope in Part 3 of this series. For now, we hold the resemblance as a reason to investigate, not as a conclusion to assert. White's caution is a model for how we should approach all of the difficult questions that this subject raises. We arrive now at Chapter 6 of Eleanor White's book, and at a question that, after everything we have described, may seem almost impossibly naive. What is the way out? How does a crime that is designed to be invisible, that is built from the ground up for deniability, that is protected by a self-reinforcing loop of pathologization and official denial, how does such a crime ever get stopped? White's answer is bracingly unglamorous. She does not call for exotic new powers. She does not propose a technological solution. She does not advocate for vigilante counteraction. She looks at the problem the way an engineer would, and she says, the tools already exist. They are simply not being used. This is, in a strange way, hopeful. If the solution required some unprecedented new invention, the task would be overwhelming. But if the solution already exists and simply needs to be applied, then the task is political and legal rather than technological. Political and legal tasks are things that movements can accomplish. They have been accomplished before, again and again, in the long history of social reform. White's prescription rests on 3 pillars. First, apply the anti-stalking laws that were written in the early 1990s to organized groups. These laws were drafted with individual stalkers in mind, but their language is broad enough to encompass group-based harassment. The problem is not the law. The problem is the enforcement. Second, name organized stalking explicitly in statute. Add the words to the legal code so that police and prosecutors can no longer pretend the category does not exist. This is a classic legislative fix. If the system cannot see the crime, change the system's vocabulary until it can. And third, fix the due process void. A target of organized stalking today gets no visible accuser, no formal charges, no trial, and no appeal. It is a prosecution with no defense. That is fundamentally incompatible with any conception of justice, and it needs to be recognized as such. These are not radical demands. They are the absolute minimum requirements of a functioning legal system. That they have not been met, that they have not even been seriously discussed in most jurisdictions, is itself a measure of how thoroughly the machinery of denial has operated. Let us look more closely at White's central claim about the way forward. That the laws already exist. They are simply not being applied. She points to the United States. Let us now lay out White's full prescription for justice in its 3 component parts, each of which addresses a specific failure in the current system. First, apply the anti-stalking laws we already have. White writes, and I quote, "It is time for the anti-stalking laws of the early 1990s to finally be applied to organized stalking groups. This is the most modest demand imaginable. She is not asking for new laws. She is asking for the existing laws to be enforced. The statutes are on the books. The legal framework exists. What is missing is the institutional will to recognize that group-based harassment directed at a single individual constitutes stalking under the law, even when the individual acts are designed to look like ordinary life. Second, name it in statute. Legislators should add explicit references to organized stalking and to its characteristic tactics into stalking law. This is important because it removes the linguistic escape hatch that officials currently use. As long as organized stalking is not named in the law, officials can claim that it does not exist. Once it is named, that claim becomes legally untenable. The act of naming is itself a powerful intervention. It says to law enforcement, to prosecutors, to judges, and to the public. This is real. It has a name. It is a crime. The law does not just punish crime. The law also defines what counts as a crime in the first place. And if something is not named in the law, it effectively does not exist in the legal universe. White's demand is to bring organized stalking into that universe, to give it legal reality. Third, fix the due process void. This is perhaps the most fundamental issue of all. In a normal criminal proceeding, the accused has the right to face their accuser, to hear the charges against them, to mount a defense, and to appeal an adverse judgment. A target of organized stalking has none of these rights. They are accused, tried, convicted, and punished by an invisible tribunal with no transparency, no accountability, and no appeal. The harassment itself is the punishment, and it is administered by anonymous enforcers who follow a script written by someone the target will never meet. This is not justice. It is not even a parody of justice. It is the complete absence of justice, a void where the rule of law should be. And underneath all three of these demands is White's central thesis, the reason a project like knowledge targeting exists at all. She writes, and I quote, "If organized stalking were to become sufficiently well known to the general public, it is unlikely this crime could continue. Sunlight is the countermeasure. Public awareness is the one thing the crime cannot survive. And that is the mission." We have covered an enormous amount of ground in this episode, and before we look ahead to what comes next, let us consolidate what we have learned. 5 takeaways from Part 1 of Knowledge Targeting. 5 things to carry with you as we move deeper into this series. Takeaway number 1. Organized stalking is a group crime. It is defined by many networked strangers acting on your name. It is not one obsessed person. It is not a jealous former partner. It is not an individual with a fixation. It is a distributed network of ordinary people who have been given a target and who participate in that target's destruction, usually without ever knowing the target personally and without any personal grievance. The group nature of the crime is what makes it qualitatively different from conventional stalking and what makes it so difficult to detect, to report, and to stop. Takeaway number 2. Most targets never learn why they were chosen. Eleanor White estimates that roughly 70% of targets fall into the unknown category, with no discernible reason for their targeting. And this void, this absence of an explanation, is not a coincidence. It is itself part of the attack. Not knowing isolates the target. It destabilizes them psychologically. It prevents them from constructing a narrative that would help them seek justice. The question, "Why me?" is the question every target asks, and for 7 out of 10, the answer is a terrifying silence. Takeaway number 3. The data agrees. The government's own statistics from the United States Department of Justice, from the United Kingdom Home Office, from Statistics Canada, carry a multi-stalker, multi-year signature that fits the profile of organized stalking and that cannot be explained by the conventional model of individual stalking. The numbers are not hidden. They are published. They are available to anyone who cares to look. And they show, quietly but persistently, that something is happening that the official narrative does not account for. Takeaway number 4. Deniability is the engine. The crime is engineered so that reporting it turns the system, especially the mental health system, against you. Every act is designed to look like ordinary life. The pattern is invisible to bystanders. The report sounds like paranoia. The official response is a referral to psychiatry. And the psychiatric label then pre-explains every future complaint as a symptom. It is a perfect self-reinforcing trap. And takeaway number 5. Awareness is the cure. Eleanor White's central thesis is that public knowledge is the one thing organized stalking cannot survive. The crime depends on invisibility. It depends on the public's ignorance of its existence. It depends on the target's inability to name what is happening to them. If the public knows, if the terminology is common knowledge, if the tactics are recognized, then the crime loses its most essential weapon, its invisibility, which is exactly why we are making this series. Before we close this episode, a word about why knowledge targeting exists and why TI1 Voice was built in the first place. TI1 Voice is a platform founded on a single simple idea, that no target of organized stalking should have to stand alone. The experience of being a targeted individual is defined by isolation. By definition, the crime isolates you from your community, from your friends, from your family, from your coworkers, from the institutions that are supposed to protect you. The lie campaign turns the people around you against you. The deniability loop makes you sound paranoid when you try to explain. The psychiatric weapon turns your sane response to real persecution into a diagnosis that discredits you permanently. Everything about the crime is designed to make you alone. And that is precisely why community is the countermeasure. TI1 Voice takes the scattered, fragmented testimony of individual targets and turns it into structured, comparable evidence. We give isolated people a way to connect with each other, to compare experiences, to recognize the patterns that are invisible when you are alone but become unmistakable when you can compare notes with someone else who is going through the same thing. We build the historical record that makes this crime harder and harder to deny. We are compiling the evidence, case by case, year by year, that will eventually force official recognition. If this episode has named something that you have lived, if the descriptions of organized stalking resonated with your own experience, then we invite you to add your voice. Sign the declaration. Contribute your documentation. Help us build the record that will make this crime unignorable. Your testimony, combined with the testimony of thousands of others, becomes something more powerful than any individual story could ever be. It becomes data. It becomes history. It becomes the foundation for legal and social change. And if you want company while you do this work, if you need to know that you are not alone during the long hours when the harassment is at its worst, we have built a resource for that. TITV is our 24/7 live stream, a constant presence for the community of targeted individuals. You can find it at meet.witisk.org, and it is always on. You are not alone. That is the message. That is the purpose. That is why we exist. Every episode of Knowledge Targeting is built on a foundation of documented sources, and this episode is no exception. Before we conclude, let us acknowledge where our information comes from so that you, the viewer, can verify it for yourself. Our primary source is Eleanor White's book, Organized Stalking: A Target's View. This book is the foundational text of the entire field. It is held in the TI One Voice knowledge base as document number 765, and it runs approximately 115,000 words across 7 chapters. You can access it through the knowledge base at one.witisk.org. Our statistical data comes from 3 official government sources. First, the United States Department of Justice Bureau of Justice Statistics publication titled Stalking Victimization in the United States, published in January 2009 under catalog number NCJ 224527. This is the source for the multi-stalker and duration statistics we have discussed in Chapter 4. Second, the United Kingdom Home Office data on crime in England and Wales, specifically the stalking and harassment statistics from 2001, which provided the estimate of nearly 2 million victims and the surprising gender distribution. Third, Statistics Canada data on criminal harassment from 2006, which showed the multi-perpetrator signature in the Canadian context. Eleanor White's own website and resource collection, originally hosted at Stopos.info, has served as an archival reference for the organized stalking community, though that site is no longer active and is preserved only through archival snapshots. We also acknowledge the many photographers and creators whose images, used under Creative Commons licenses or in the public domain, appear in the slide deck accompanying this episode. Their work enriches our presentation, and we are grateful. If any source we have used is incorrectly attributed, or if you believe additional sources should be cited, we welcome correction. Contact us through the TI One Voice platform. This series is a living document, and we are committed to accuracy and transparency. We close this episode with a look ahead. If Part 1 defined the crime, Part 2 opens the toolbox. The next episode of Knowledge Targeting is titled The Anatomy of Gang Stalking, and it takes apart Eleanor White's master menu tactic by tactic. We will examine street theater in forensic detail, how it is organized, how it is performed, and why it is so psychologically devastating to those who endure it. We will explore noise campaigns, the systematic use of sound, car horns, alarms, construction equipment, barking dogs, to deprive targets of sleep and to erode their mental stability through sensory assault. We will look at what targets call sensitization, the process by which everyday objects and situations become triggers for psychological distress, because the harassers have systematically paired them with unpleasant experiences. We will analyze workplace mobbing, the variant of organized stalking that occurs in professional environments, and the specific techniques used to destroy a target's career and professional reputation. We will show, step by step, how a bespoke harassment program is assembled for a single human being from the vast catalog of tactics that White calls the master menu. The machine in detail. That is Part 2. Everything we have learned in this episode, the 3-part definition, the 70% unknown selection rate, David Lawson's 12-year undercover investigation, the hidden scale in the government's own numbers, and the engine of deniability that makes the whole system work, is preparation for what comes next. Now that we understand what organized stalking is, we can begin to understand exactly how it operates, tactic by tactic, victim by victim, day by day. The mechanics of persecution, laid bare. This has been Knowledge Targeting Part 1, Organized Stalking, A Target's View. Based on the book by Eleanor White, Knowledge-Based Document 765. I am your narrator. Thank you for watching. Join us next time.